Carlos Castaneda's A Separate Reality. Part 1, The Preliminaries of Seeing. Chapter 6. Just as we were getting into my car to start on a trip to central Mexico on October 5th, 1968, Don Juan stopped me. "I have told you before," he said, with a serious expression, that one should never reveal the name nor the whereabouts of a sorcerer. I believe you understood that you should never reveal my name nor the place where my body is. Now I'm going to ask you to do the same with a friend of mine, a friend you will call Gennaro. We are going to his house. You will spend some time there." I assured Don Juan that I had never betrayed his confidence. "I know that," he said without changing his serious expression. "Yet I am concerned with your becoming thoughtless." I protested, and Don Juan said his aim was only to remind me that every time one was careless in matters of sorcery, one was playing with an imminent and senseless death that could be averted by being thoughtful and aware. "We will not touch upon this matter any longer," he said. "Once we leave my house, we will not mention Gennaro, nor will we think about him. I want you to put your thoughts in order now. When you meet him, you must be clear and have no doubts in your mind." "What kind of doubts are you referring to, Don Juan?" "Any kinds of doubts whatever. When you meet him, you ought to be crystal clear. He will see you." His strange admonitions made me very apprehensive. I mentioned that perhaps I should not meet his friend at all, but only drive to the vicinity of his friend's house and leave him there. "What I've told you was only a precaution," he said. "You've met one sorcerer already, Vicente, and he nearly killed you. Watch out this time." After we arrived in central Mexico, it took us 2 days to walk from where I left my car to his friend's house, a little shack perched on the side of a mountain. Don Juan's friend was at the door, as if he had been waiting for us. I recognized him immediately. I had already made his acquaintance, although very briefly, when I brought my book to Don Juan. I had not really looked at him at that time, except in a glancing fashion, so I had had the feeling he was as old as Don Juan. As he stood at the door of his house, however, I noticed that he was definitely younger. He was perhaps in his early 60s. He was shorter than Don Juan, slimmer, very dark and wiry. His hair was thick and graying and a bit long. It ran over his ears and forehead. His face was round and hard. A very prominent nose made him look like a bird of prey with small dark eyes. He talked to Don Juan first. Don Juan noted affirmatively. They conversed briefly. They were not speaking Spanish, so I did not understand what they were saying. Then Gennaro turned to me. "You're welcome to my humble little shack," he said apologetically in Spanish. His words were a polite formula I had heard before in various rural areas of Mexico. Yet, as he said the words, he laughed joyously for no overt reason, and I knew he was exercising his controlled folly. He did not care in the least that his house was a shack. I liked Don Gennaro very much. For the next 2 days, we went into the mountains to collect plants. Don Juan, Don Gennaro, and I left each day at the crack of dawn. The 2 old men went together to some specific but unidentified part of the mountains and left me alone in one area of the woods. I had an exquisite feeling there. I did not notice the passage of time, nor was I apprehensive at staying alone. The extraordinary experience I had both days was an uncanny capacity to concentrate on the delicate task of finding the specific plants Don Juan had entrusted me to collect. We returned to the house in the late afternoon, and both days I was so tired that I fell asleep immediately. The 3rd day, however, was different. The 3rd day we worked together, and Don Juan asked Don Gennaro to teach me how to select certain plants. We returned around noon, and the 2 old men sat for hours in front of the house, in complete silence, as if they were in a state of trance. Yet they were not asleep. I walked around them a couple of times. Don Juan followed my movements with his eyes, and so did Gennaro. You must talk to the plants before you pick them, Don Juan said. He dropped his words casually and repeated his statement 3 times, as if to catch my attention. Nobody had said a word until he spoke. In order to see the plants, you must talk to them personally, he went on. You must get to know them individually. Then the plants can tell you anything you care to know about them. It was late in the afternoon. Don Juan was sitting on a flat rock facing the western mountains. Don Gennaro was sitting by him on a straw mat with his face toward the north. Don Juan told me the first day we were there that those were the positions, and that I had to sit on the ground at any place opposite to both of them. He added that while we sat in those positions, I had to keep my face toward the southeast and look at them only in brief glances. Yes, that's the way it is with plants, isn't it, Don Juan said, and turned to Don Gennaro, who agreed with an affirmative gesture. I told him that the reason I had not followed his instructions was because I felt a little stupid talking to plants. You fail to understand that a sorcerer is not joking, he said severely. When a sorcerer attempts to see, he attempts to gain power. Don Gennaro was staring at me. I was taking notes, and that seemed to baffle him. He smiled at me, shook his head, and said something to Don Juan. Don Juan shrugged his shoulders. To see me writing must have been quite odd for Don Gennaro. Don Juan was, I suppose, habituated to my taking notes, and the fact that I wrote while he spoke was no longer odd to him. He could carry on talking without appearing to notice my acts. Don Gennaro, however, kept on laughing, and I had to stop writing in order not to disrupt the mood of the conversation. Don Juan affirmed again that a sorcerer's acts were not to be taken as jokes because a sorcerer played with death at every turn of the way. Then he proceeded to relate to Don Gennaro the story of how one night I had looked at the lights of death following me during one of our trips. The story proved to be utterly funny. Don Gennaro rolled on the ground laughing. Don Juan apologized to me and said that his friend was given to explosions of laughter. I glanced at Don Gennaro, whom I thought was still rolling on the ground, and I saw him performing a most unusual act. He was standing on his head without the aid of his arms or hands, and his legs were crossed as if he were sitting. The sight was so incongruous that it made me jump. When I realized he was doing something almost impossible from the point of view of body mechanics, he had gone back again to normal sitting position. Don Juan, however, seemed to be cognizant of what was involved and celebrated Don Gennaro's performance with roaring laughter. Don Gennaro seemed to have noticed my confusion. He clapped his hands a couple of times and rolled on the ground again. Apparently, he wanted me to watch him. What had at first appeared to be rolling on the ground was actually leaning over in a sitting position and touching the ground with his head. He seemingly obtained his illogical posture by gaining momentum, leaning over several times until the inertia carried his body to a vertical stand so that for an instant he sat on his head. When the laughter subsided, Don Juan continued talking. His tone was very severe. I shifted the position of my body in order to be at ease and give him all my attention. He did not smile at all, as he usually does, especially when I pay deliberate attention to what he is saying. Don Gennaro kept looking at me as if he were expecting me to start writing again, but I did not take notes anymore. Don Juan's words were a reprimand for not talking to the plants I had collected, as he had always told me to do. He said the plants I had killed would also have killed me. He said he was sure they would, sooner or later, make me get ill. He added that if I became ill as a result of hurting plants, I would, however, slough it off and believe I had only a touch of the flu. The two of them had another moment of mirth. Then Don Juan became serious again and said that if I did not think of my death, my entire life would be only personal chaos. He looked very stern. What else can a man have except his life and his death, he said to me. At that point, I felt it was indispensable to take notes, and I began writing again. Don Gennaro stared at me and smiled. Then he tilted his head back a little and opened his nostrils. He apparently had remarkable control over the muscles operating his nostrils, because they opened up to perhaps twice their normal size. What was most comical about his clowning was not so much his gestures as his reactions to them. After he enlarged his nostrils, he tumbled down laughing and worked his body again into the same strange, sitting on his head, upside down posture. Don Juan laughed until tears came rolling down his cheeks. I felt a bit embarrassed and laughed nervously. Gennaro doesn't like writing, Don Juan said in an explanation. I put my notes away, but Don Gennaro assured me that it was all right to write because he did not really mind it. I gathered my notes again and began writing. He repeated the same hilarious motions, and both of them had the same reactions again. Don Juan looked at me, still laughing, and said that his friend was portraying me, that my tendency was to open my nostrils whenever I woke, and that Don Gennaro thought that trying to become a sorcerer by taking notes was as absurd as sitting on one's head, and thus he had made up the ludicrous posture of resting the weight of his sitting body on his head. Perhaps you don't think it's funny, Don Juan said, but only Gennaro can work his way up to sitting on his head, and only you can think of learning to be a sorcerer by writing your way up. They both had another explosion of laughter, and Don Gennaro repeated his incredible movement. I liked him. There was so much grace and directness in his acts. My apologies, Don Gennaro said, pointing to the writing pad. It's all right, he said, and chuckled again. I could not write anymore. They went on talking for a long time about how plants could actually kill and how sorcerers use plants in that capacity. Both of them kept staring at me while they talked as if they expected me to write. Carlos is like a horse that doesn't like to be saddled, Don Juan said. You have to be very slow with him. You scared him, and now he won't write. Don Gennaro expanded his nostrils and said in a mocking plea, frowning and puckering his mouth, Come on, Carlitos, write. Write until your thumbs fall off. Don Juan stood up, stretching his arms and arching his back. In spite of his advanced age, his body seemed to be powerful and limber. He went to the bushes at the side of the house, and I was left alone with Don Gennaro. He looked at me, and I moved my eyes away because he made me feel embarrassed. Don't tell me you're not going to look at me, he said with the most hilarious intonation. He opened his nostrils and made them quiver. Then he stood up and repeated Don Juan's movement, arching his back and stretching his arms, but with his body contorted into a most ludicrous position. It was truly indescribable gesture that combined an exquisite sense of pantomime and a sense of ridiculousness. It enthralled me. It was a masterful caricature of Don Juan. Don Juan came back at that moment and caught the gesture and obviously the meaning also. He sat down chuckling. Which direction is the wind, Don Gennaro asked casually. Don Juan pointed to the west with a movement of his head. I'd better go where the wind blows, Don Gennaro said with a serious expression. He then turned and shook his finger at me. And don't you pay any attention if you hear strange noises, he said. When Gennaro shifts, the mountains tremble. He leaped into the bushes, and a moment later I heard a very strange noise, a deep, unearthly rumble. I did not know what to make of it. I looked at Don Juan for a clue, but he was doubled over with laughter. October 17th, 1968. I don't remember what prompted Don Gennaro to tell me about the arrangement of the other world, as he called it. He said that a master sorcerer was an eagle, or rather that he could make himself into an eagle. On the other hand, an evil sorcerer was a tecote, I'm going to get this right, Tecolote, tecote, an owl. Don Gennaro said that an evil sorcerer was a child of the night, and for such a man, the most useful animals were the mountain lion, or other wild cats, or the night birds, especially the owl. He said that the brujos, lyricos, the lyric sorcerers, meaning the dilettante sorcerers, preferred other animals, a crow, for example. Don Juan laughed. He had been listening in silence. Don Gennaro turned to him and said, "That's true, you know that, Don Juan." Then he said that a master sorcerer could take his disciple on a journey with him and actually pass through the 10 layers to the other world. The master, provided that he was an eagle, could start at the very bottom layer and then go through each successive world until he reached the top. Evil sorcerers and dilettantes could at best, he said, go through only 3 layers. Don Gennaro gave a description of what those steps were by saying, "You start at the very bottom, then your teacher takes you with him within his flight, and soon, boom, you go through the first layer. Then a little while later, boom, you go through the second, and boom, you go through the third." Don Gennaro took me through 10 booms to the last layer of the world. Then he finished talking. Don Juan looked at me and smiled knowingly. "Talking is not Gennaro's predilection," he said, "but if you care to get a lesson, he will teach you about the equilibrium of things." Don Gennaro nodded affirmatively. He puckered up his mouth and closed his eyelids halfway. I thought his gesture was delightful. Don Gennaro stood up, and so did Don Juan. "All right," Don Gennaro said, "let's go then. We could go and wait for Nestor and Pablito. They're through now. On Thursdays, they're through early." Both of them got in my car. Don Gennaro sat in the front. I did not ask them anything, but simply started the engine. Don Gennaro directed me to a place he said was Nestor's home. Don Gennaro went into the house, and a while later came out with Nestor and Pablito, 2 young men who were his apprentices. They all got in my car, and Don Juan told me to take the road toward the western mountains. We left my car on the side of a dirt road and walked along a bank of a river, which was perhaps 15 or 20 feet across, to a waterfall that was visible from where I had parked. It was late afternoon. The scenery was quite impressive. Directly above us there was a huge dark bluish cloud that looked like a floating roof. It had a well-defined edge and a shape like an enormous half circle. To the west, on the high mountains of the Cordillera Central, the rain seemed to be descending on the slopes. It looked like a whitish curtain of falling on the green peaks. To the east there was the long, deep valley. There were only scattered clouds over the valley, and the sun was shining there. The contrast between the 2 areas was magnificent. We stopped at the bottom of the waterfall. It was perhaps 150 feet high. The roar was very loud. Don Gennaro fastened a belt around his waist. He had at least 7 items hanging from it. They looked like small gourds. He took off his hat and let it hang on his back from a cord tied around his neck. He put on a headband, and he took from a pouch made of thick wool fabric. The headband was also made of wool of various colors. A sharp yellow was the most prominent of them. He inserted 3 feathers in the headband. They seemed to be eagle feathers. I noticed that the places where he had inserted them were not symmetrical. One feather was above the back curve of his right ear, the other was a few inches from the front, and the third was over his left temple. Then he took off his sandals, hooked or tied them to the waist of his trousers and fastened his belt over his poncho. The belt seemed to be made of woven strips of leather. I could not see whether he tied it or buckled it. Don Gennaro walked toward the waterfall. Don Juan manipulated a round rock into a steady position and sat down on it. The two other young men did the same with some rocks and sat down to his left. Don Juan pointed to a place next to him on his right side and told me to bring a rock and sit by him. "We must make a line here," he said, showing me that the three were sitting in a row. By then, Don Gennaro had reached the very bottom of the waterfall and had begun climbing a trail on the right side of it. From where we were sitting, the trail looked fairly deep. There were a lot of shrubs, and he used as railings. At one moment, he seemed to lose his footing and almost slid down, as if the dirt were slippery. A moment later, the same thing happened, and the thought crossed my mind that perhaps Don Gennaro was too old to be climbing. I saw him slipping and stumbling several times before he reached the spot where the trail ended. I experienced a sort of apprehension when he began to climb the rocks. I could not figure out what he was going to do. "What's he doing?" I asked Don Juan in a whisper. Don Juan did not look at me. "Obviously he's climbing," he said. Don Juan was looking straight at Don Gennaro. His gaze was fixed. His eyelids were half crossed. He was sitting very erect. His hands seemed to be resting his legs on the edge of the rock. I leaned over a little bit to see the two young men. Don Juan made an imperative gesture with his hands to make me get back in line. I retreated immediately. I had only a glimpse of the young men. They seemed to be as attentive as he was. Don Juan made another gesture with his hand and pointed to the direction of the waterfall. I looked again. Don Gennaro had climbed quite a way on the rocky wall. At the moment I looked, he was perched on the ledge, inching his way slowly to circumvent a huge boulder. His arms were spread as if he were embracing the rock. He moved slowly toward his right, and suddenly he lost his footing. I gasped involuntarily. For a moment, his whole body hung in the air. I was sure he was going to fall, but he did not. His right hand had grabbed onto something, and the very agility of his feet went back on the ledge again. But before he moved on, he turned to us and looked. It was only a glance. There was, however, such a stylization to the movement of turning his head that I began to wonder. I remember then that he had done the same thing, turning to look us every time he slipped. I had thought that Don Gennaro must have felt embarrassed by his clumsiness and turned to see if we were looking. He climbed a bit more to the top, suffering another loss of footing, and hung perilously on the overhang rock face. This time he was supported by his left hand, and when he regained his balance, he turned and looked at us again. He slipped twice more before he reached the top. From where we were sitting, the crest of the waterfall seemed to be 20 to 25 feet across. Don Gennaro stood motionless for a moment. I wanted to ask Don Juan what Don Gennaro was going to do up there. Don Juan seemed to be so absorbed in watching that I did not dare disturb him. Suddenly, Don Gennaro jumped onto the water. It was such a thoroughly unexpected action that I felt a vacuum in the pit of my stomach. It was a magnificent, outlandish leap. For a second, I had the clear sensation that I had seen a series of superimposed images of his body making an elliptical flight to the middle of the stream. When my surprise receded, I noticed that he had landed on a rock on the edge of the fall, a rock that was hardly visible from where we were standing. He stayed perched there for a long time. He seemed to be fighting the power of the onrushing water. Twice he hung over the precipice, and I could not determine what he was clinging to. He gained his balance and squatted on the rock. Then he leaped again, like a tiger. I could barely see the next rock where he landed. It was like a small cone on the very edge of the fall. He remained there for almost 10 minutes. He was motionless. His immobility was so impressive to me that I was shivering. I could not get up and walk around. Don Juan noticed my nervousness and told me imperatively to be calm. Don Gennaro's stillness plunged me into an extraordinary and mysterious terror. I felt that if he remained perched there any longer, I could not control myself. Suddenly he jumped again, this time all the way to the other bank of the waterfall. He landed on his feet and hands like a feline. He remained in a squat position for a moment. Then he stood up and looked across the fall to the other side and then down at us. He stayed dead still, looking at us. His hands were clasped at his sides, as if he were holding on to an unseen railing. Then there was something truly exquisite about his posture. His body seemed so nimble, so frail. I thought that Don Gennaro, with his headband and feathers, his dark poncho, and his bare feet, was the most beautiful human being I had ever seen. He threw his arms up suddenly, lifted his head, and flipped his body swiftly in a sort of lateral somersault to his left. The boulder where he had been standing was round, and when he jumped, he disappeared behind it. Huge drops of rain began to fall at that moment. Don Juan got up, and so did the two young men. Their movements were so abrupt that it confused me. Don Gennaro's masterful feat had thrown me into a state of profound emotional excitement. I felt he was a consummate artist, and I wanted to see him right then to applaud him. I strained to look on the left side of the waterfall to see if he was coming down, but he was not. I insisted on knowing what had happened to him. Don Juan did not answer. "We better hurry out of here," he said. "It's a real downpour. We have to take Nestor and Pablito to their house. Then we'll have to start on our trip back." "I didn't even say goodbye to Don Gennaro," I complained. "He already said goodbye to you," Don Juan answered harshly. He peered at me for an instant. Then he softened his frown and smiled. He has also wished you well," he said. "He felt happy with you." "But aren't you going to wait for him?" "No," Don Juan said sharply. "Let him be, wherever he is. Perhaps he is an eagle flying to another world, or perhaps he has died up there. It doesn't matter now." October 23rd, 1968. Don Juan casually mentioned that he was going to make another trip to central Mexico in the near future. "Are you going to visit Don Gennaro?" I asked. "Perhaps," he said, without looking at me. "But he's all right, isn't he, Don Juan? I mean, nothing bad happened to him up there on top of the waterfall, did it?" "Nothing happened to him. He is 30. We talked about his projected trip for a while. Then I said I had enjoyed Don Gennaro's company and his jokes. He laughed and said that Don Gennaro was truly like a child. There was a long pause. I struggled with my mind to find an opening line to ask him about his lesson. Don Juan looked at me and said in a mischievous tone, "You're dying to ask me about Don Gennaro's lesson, aren't you?" I laughed with embarrassment. I had been obsessed with everything that took place at the waterfall. I had been hashing and rehashing all the details I could remember, and my conclusions were that I had witnessed an incredible feat of physical prowess. I thought Don Juan was beyond a doubt a peerless master of equilibrium. Every single movement he had performed was highly ritualized, and needless to say, he must have had some inextricable symbolic meaning. "Yes," I said, "I admit I am dying to know what his lesson was." "Let me tell you something," Don Juan said. "It was a waste of time for you. His lesson was for someone who can see. Pablito and Nestor got the gist of it, although they don't see very well. But you went there to look. I told Gennaro that you are a very strange, plugged-up fool, and that perhaps you'd get unplugged up with his lesson. But you didn't. It doesn't matter, though. Seeing is very difficult. I didn't want you to speak to Gennaro afterwards, so we had to leave. Too bad. Yet it would have been worse to say, Gennaro risked a great deal to show you something magnificent. Too bad you can't see. Perhaps, Don Juan, if you tell me what the lesson was, I may find out that I really saw. Don Juan doubled up with laughter. Your best feature is asking questions, he said. He was apparently going to drop the subject again. We were sitting as usual in the area in front of his house. He suddenly got up and walked inside. I trailed behind him and insisted on describing to him what I had seen. I faithfully followed the sequence of events as I remembered it. Don Juan kept on smiling while I spoke. When I had finished, he shook his head. Seeing is very difficult, he said. I begged him to explain his statement. Seeing is not a matter of talk, he said imperatively. Obviously, he wasn't going to tell me anything anymore, so I gave up and left the house to run some errands for him. When I returned, it was already dark. We had something to eat, and afterwards we walked out to the Ramada and had no sooner sat down than Don Juan began to talk about Don Gennaro's lesson. He did not give me any time to prepare myself for it. I did not have my notes with me, but it was too dark to write, and I did not want to alter the flow of his talk by going inside the house for the kerosene lantern. He said that Don Gennaro, being a master of balance, could perform very complex and very difficult movements. Sitting on his head was one such movement. With it, he had attempted to show me that it was impossible to see while I took notes. The action of sitting on his head without the aid of his hands was, at best, a freakish stunt that lasted for only an instant. In Gennaro's opinion, writing about seeing was the same. That is, it was a precarious maneuver, as odd and unnecessary as sitting on one's head. Don Gennaro peered at me in the dark and in a very dramatic tone said that while Don Gennaro was horsing around, sitting on his head, I was on the very verge of seeing. Don Gennaro noticed it and repeated his maneuvers over and over to no avail, because I lost the thread right away. Don Juan said that afterwards, Don Gennaro, moved by his personal liking of me, attempted in a very dramatic way to bring me back to the verge of seeing. After a very careful, deliberation, he decided to show me a feat of equilibrium by crossing the waterfall. He felt that the waterfall was like the edge on which I was standing, was confident that I could also make it across. Don Juan then explained Don Gennaro's feat. He said that he had already told me that human beings were, for those who saw, luminous beings, composed of something like fibers of light, which rotated from the front to the back and maintained the appearance of an egg. He said that he had also told me that the most astonishing part of the egg-like creatures was a set of long fibers that came out from the area around the navel. Don Juan said that those fibers were of the utmost importance in the life of a man. Those fibers were the secret of Don Gennaro's balance, and his lesson had nothing to do with the acrobatic jumps across the waterfall. His feat of equilibrium was in the way he used those tentacle-like fibers. Don Juan dropped the subject as suddenly as he had started it and began to talk about something thoroughly unrelated. October 24th, 1968. I cornered Don Juan and I told him I felt intuitively. Wait a minute. I cornered Don Juan and told him I intuitively felt that I was never going to get another lesson in equilibrium, and that he had to explain to me all the pertinent details, which I would otherwise never discover myself. Don Juan said I was right, insofar as knowing that Don Gennaro would never give me another lesson. What else do you want to know? He asked. What are those tentacle-like fibers, Don Juan? They are the tentacles that come out of a man's body, which are apparent to any sorcerer who sees. Sorcerers act towards people in accordance to the way they see their tentacles. Weak persons have very short, almost invisible fibers. Strong persons have very bright, long ones. Gennaro's, for instance, are so bright that they resemble thickness. You can tell from the fibers if a person is healthy, or if he is sick, or if he is mean or kind or treacherous. You can also tell from the fibers if a person can see. Here is a baffling problem. When Gennaro saw you, he knew, just like my friend Vincente did, that you could see. When I see you, I see that you can see, and yet I know myself that you can't. How baffling. Gennaro can't get over that. I told him that you were a strange fool. I think he wanted to see that for himself and took you to the waterfall. What do you think I gave him why do you think I gave him the impression I can see? Don Juan didn't answer me. He remained silent for a long time. I did not want to ask him anything else. Finally, he spoke to me and said that he knew why, but did not know how to explain it. You think everything in the world is simple to understand, he said, because everything you do is a routine that is simple to understand. At the waterfall, when you looked at Gennaro moving across the water, you believed that he was a master of somersaults, because somersaults was all that you could think about. And that is all that you will ever believe he did. Yet Gennaro never jumped across the waterfall. If he had jumped, he would have died. Gennaro balanced himself on his superb, bright fibers. He made them long enough so he could, let's say, roll on them across the waterfall. He demonstrated the proper way to make those tentacles long and how to move them with precision. Pablito saw nearly all of Gennaro's movements. Nestor, on the other hand, only saw the most obvious maneuvers. He missed the delicate details. But you saw nothing at all. Perhaps if you had told me beforehand, Don Juan, what to look for. He interrupted me and said that giving me instructions would only have hindered Don Gennaro. Had I known what was going to take place, my fibers would have been agitated and would have interfered with Don Gennaro's. If you could see, he said, it would have been obvious to you from the very first step that Gennaro took that he was not slipping as he went upside the waterfall. He was loosening his tentacles. Twice he made them go around the boulders and held to the sheer rock like a fly. When he got to the top, he was ready to cross the water, he focused them onto a small rock in the middle of the stream. And when they were secured there, he let the fibers pull him. Gennaro never jumped. Therefore, he could land on the slippery surface of the small boulders at the very edge of the water. His fibers were at all times neatly wrapped around every rock he used. He did not stay on the first boulder very long because he had the rest of his fibers tied onto another one, even smaller, at the place where the onrush of the water was greatest. His tentacles pulled him again, and he landed on it. That was the most outstanding thing he did. The surface was too small for a man to hold onto, and the onrush of the water would have washed his body over the precipice had he not had some of his fibers still focused on the first rock. He stayed on that second position for a long time because he had to draw out his tentacles again and send them across the water to the other side of the fall. When he had them secured, he had to release the fibers focused on the first rock. That was very tricky. Perhaps only Gennaro could do that. He nearly lost his grip, or maybe he was only fooling us. We'll never know that for sure. Personally, I think he nearly lost his grip. I know that because he became rigid and sent out a magnificent shoot, like a beam of light across the water. I feel that beam alone could have pulled him through. When he got to the other side, he stood up and let his fibers glow like a cluster of lights. That was the one thing he did just for you. If you had been able to see, you would have seen that. Gennaro stood there looking at you, and then he knew that you had not seen. End of chapter.